In the sleepy village of Chipping Norton, a grandfather clock strikes 13 at dawn, shattering the silence of Hazelwood House. Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets, hidden compartments, midnight intruders, and a naval scandal buried in the past. Is it a ghostly omen, or a cunning plot driven by greed? As footsteps echo in the night and a mysterious stranger lurks, Miss Marple races against time to uncover the truth before the clock strikes again. Chapter 1. The Village of Chipping Norton. The morning sun cast a golden haze over Chipping Norton, a village tucked into the folds of the English countryside, where stone cottages huddled together like gossiping neighbors. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, and the leaves, turning amber and scarlet, whispered as they fell. In her neat, unassuming cottage on Willow Lane, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of a metronome. Her hands, delicate but steady, worked a soft gray wool into a scarf, though her eyes bright and sharp as a hawk's wandered to the world beyond her lace curtains. Chipping Norton was a place of subtle currents, where every smile hid a story and every glance carried a question. Miss Marple, with her unerring knack for noticing what others overlooked, was its silent observer. She had lived here for years, long enough to know the village's pulse. The baker's wife who fretted over her husband's late nights, the postman who lingered too long at certain gates, the quiet feuds over garden boundaries that simmered beneath polite nods. Yet today, her thoughts were drawn to a letter that lay open on the rosewood table beside her. It was penned in the tremulous hand of Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a widow who resided in Hazelwood House, a once grand estate now softened by time and neglect. The letter was brief but urgent, its words tinged with a nervousness that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. "Dear Miss Marple," it began, "I am at my wit's end and beg your advice. The grandfather clock in my hall, a relic from my late husband's family, has begun to behave most strangely. For 3 mornings it has struck 13 times at dawn, though it has not been wound in years. The servants are frightened, and I confess I am uneasy myself. Could you call at your earliest convenience? Yours sincerely, Clara Henshaw." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her fingers lingering on the wool as she considered the matter. Clocks were dependable things, their mechanisms governed by logic and precision. A clock striking 13 was not merely a fault. It was an anomaly, a deliberate disruption of order. And disruptions, in Miss Marple's experience, often pointed to human hands and human motives. She recalled a similar incident in her youth, when a church clock in a neighboring village chimed erratically, only to reveal a prank by a disgruntled sexton. But Clara Henshaw's tone suggested something more sinister than mischief. Rising from her chair, she smoothed her tweed skirt and glanced at the mantel clock, which ticked with reassuring regularity. It was just past 11, time enough to visit Hazelwood House before lunch. She gathered her shawl and a small notebook, for Miss Marple was methodical in her observations, jotting down details that others might dismiss as trivial. As she stepped into the lane, the village hummed with its usual rhythm, the clatter of a milk cart, the laughter of children dawdling to school, the faint peal of the church bell, practicing for Sunday. Yet beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed a thread of unease, as if Chipping Norton itself were holding its breath. Hazelwood House stood at the village's edge, its wrought iron gates rusted but proud. The gravel drive crunched under Miss Marple's sensible shoes as she approached, noting the overgrown rose beds and the ivy that clung like a possessive lover to the stone walls. Clara Henshaw met her at the door, a slight woman with anxious eyes and a lace cap slightly askew. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you for coming," she said, her voice a flutter of nerves. "I scarcely know what to think." She led Miss Marple into the hall, where the grandfather clock stood like a sentinel. Its mahogany case was polished, but scarred, its face adorned with Roman numerals that gleamed faintly in the dim light. The pendulum swung with a slow, hypnotic tick-tock, and Miss Marple felt the weight of its presence as if it were watching her as much as she was watching it. "It's been silent since my husband's death," Clara explained, wringing her hands. "He was Captain Henshaw, you know, a naval man. The clock was his pride, brought from his family's home in Devon. But now, 13 strikes every dawn. It's unnatural." Miss Marple knelt to examine the clock's base, her fingers tracing the carvings of ships and waves. She noticed faint scratches near the bottom, irregular and fresh, as if someone had probed the wood with a tool. "Have you had any visitors lately, Mrs. Henshaw?" she asked, her tone mild but her eyes keen. Clara hesitated, then mentioned her nephew Leonard, who had arrived from London a week ago. "A dear boy, but restless," she said. "He's been staying to help with the estate." She also spoke of Mr. Percival Gray, a local historian who had been studying the house's antiques, including the clock. "He's very knowledgeable, but rather intense," Clara added, her voice dropping. Miss Marple nodded, storing each detail like a piece in a jigsaw. As she rose, the clock's tick seemed to grow louder, a steady pulse that echoed in her mind. She thanked Clara and promised to return, her thoughts already turning. Clocks did not strike without cause, and in Shipping Norton, causes were rarely mechanical. As she walked back to Willow Lane, the autumn wind carried a chill, and Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter, sensing that the clock's 13 strikes were only the beginning of a deeper mystery. Chapter 2. The Clock's Omen. The afternoon light waned as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Hazelwood House, her steps measured but purposeful along the winding path from Chipping Norton's heart. The village was settling into its late autumn hush, with smoke curling from chimneys and the distant bark of a dog punctuating the stillness. Her morning visit had left her with a prickle of curiosity, sharper now after reflecting on Clara Henshaw's tremulous letter and the grandfather clock's inexplicable behavior. 13 strikes at dawn, unwound and unprompted, were not merely a mechanical quirk. They suggested intent, perhaps malice. Miss Marple's mind, honed by years of observing human nature, turned over the possibilities like a gardener turning soil, seeking what lay beneath. Hazelwood House loomed ahead, its stone facade softened by creeping ivy and the patina of neglect. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke, and Miss Marple noted the unkempt lawn, where dandelions had begun their quiet invasion. Clara Henshaw greeted her at the door, her face pale beneath her lace cap, her hands clasped as if to steady herself. "Miss Marple, you're so kind to return," she said, her voice a quiver of gratitude and fear. "I've not slept a wink since dawn. That clock, it's as if it's alive." They entered the hall, where the grandfather clock stood like a dark monarch, its presence dominating the space. The mahogany gleamed faintly under a shaft of light from a high window, and the pendulum's slow swing seemed to mock the silence. Miss Marple approached it, her eyes tracing the intricate carving ships under full sail, waves curling in frozen motion. The scratches she had noticed earlier were more pronounced in the afternoon light, a cluster of fine, deliberate marks near the base, as if someone had tested the wood for a hidden seam. She knelt, her fingers brushing the surface, and felt a slight irregularity, a panel that gave ever so slightly under pressure. "Most interesting," she murmured, her tone as mild as if she were commenting on the weather. Clara hovered nearby, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and the clock. "It's been like this for 3 days," she said. "Always at dawn, 13 strikes, loud enough to wake the house. The maids are talking of ghosts, and old Tompkins, the gardener, swears it's a sign of death. I don't believe in such nonsense, but," her voice faltered, "my husband, Captain Henshaw, loved that clock. He brought it from his family home in Devon when we married. It stopped the day he died 10 years ago at sea. I never had the heart to wind it again." Miss Marple straightened, her expression thoughtful. "A naval man, you said, and the clock was his pride?" Clara nodded, her eyes misty. "He'd polish it himself every Sunday. Said it kept time like a ship's chronometer." But after he was lost, it seemed wrong to let it run. Miss Marple's mind flickered to a memory of her own uncle, a retired admiral, who had spoken of clocks as the heartbeat of a ship, their precision a matter of life and death. A clock that struck unbidden, she thought, was like a ship sailing without a captain directionless, yet driven by some unseen hand. "Have you noticed anything else unusual, Mrs. Henshaw?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but probing. "Visitors, perhaps, or changes in the household?" Clara hesitated, then spoke of her nephew Leonard, who had arrived from London a week prior. "He's a good boy, but restless," she said. "He's been helping with the estate, though I suspect he finds chipping Norton dull after the city." She also mentioned Mr. Percival Gray, the local historian, who had spent hours in the house's library, cataloguing antiques. "He's taken a particular interest in the clock," Clara added. "Says it's a rare piece, from the 1780s. He's been sketching it, measuring it, even tapping the wood." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "And has anyone else shown interest in the clock?" Clara shook her head, but her fingers twisted a handkerchief, betraying her unease. "Only the servants, and they avoid it now. Mary, the parlor maid, swears she heard footsteps in the hall last night, but when she looked, no one was there." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Footsteps in the night, scratches on the clock, a nephew with restless habits, a historian with an obsessive streak. Each was a thread in a tapestry not yet woven. She turned her attention back to the clock, noting the Roman numerals on its face, the faint tarnish on the brass hands. The number 13 held no place in a clock's orderly world, yet here it was, announced with brazen clarity. "Might I see the library, Mrs. Henshaw?" she asked. Clara led her through a heavy oak door into a room lined with sagging bookshelves, their contents a mix of leather-bound volumes and faded naval charts. A desk bore traces of recent used ink smudges, a quill askew, and Miss Marple noticed a faint outline in the dust where a small object rested. As they returned to the hall, a young man descended the staircase, his step light, but his expression guarded. Leonard Henshaw was tall, with the kind of charm that came easily to those who knew its power. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his smile, though warm, did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple, I presume?" he said, extending a hand. "Aunt Clara's told me about you. Quite the village legend." His tone was playful, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease, as if he were measuring her as much as she was measuring him. "I'm merely an old woman with too much time on her hands," she replied, her smile disarming. "But I do find clocks fascinating. This one, in particular." Leonard's laugh was a shade too loud. "It's a beast, isn't it? Gives me the shivers, striking like that. Probably just old gears sticking." His casual dismissal was practiced, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, a restless rhythm that matched the clock's own. They spoke briefly, Leonard deflecting questions about his time in London with vague references to business ventures. When Miss Marple mentioned the scratches, he shrugged. "Old houses settle, don't they? Things get knocked about." But his eyes slid to the clock, and Miss Marple sensed a tension in him, like a man waiting for a storm to break. As she took her leave, promising Clara to return, the clock's tick followed her out the door, a steady pulse that seemed to whisper secrets. The village was quiet now, the sun dipping below the hills, casting long shadows across the lane. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind sifting through the morning's observations. The clock's 13 strikes were no accident, she was certain. Someone had set it to chime, perhaps to unsettle Clara, perhaps to mask something else. Leonard's charm was a veneer, and Gray's scholarly zeal might hide a deeper purpose. And then there were the footsteps in the night. Whose were they? And what did they seek? Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. She thought of a girl she had known in her youth, a maid who swore her mistress's clock rang out at midnight to warn of betrayal. The girl had been right, in a way. The clock had been tampered with to cover a theft. Clocks, Miss Marple mused, were more than timekeepers. They were witnesses, silent until provoked. And this one, in Hazelwood House, had a story to tell. She would listen, and she would understand, for in Chipping Norton, as in all small places, the truth lay in the details, and Miss Marple never missed a detail. Chapter 3. The Nephew's Shadow. The morning mist clung to Chipping Norton like a gossamer veil, softening the outlines of its stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her woolen shawl, walked briskly toward the village center, her mind as alert as her step. The grandfather clock at Hazelwood House, with its unsettling 13 strikes, had lodged itself in her thoughts like a burr. Its behavior was no mere mechanical fault. She was certain. It was a signal, a deliberate act, woven into the fabric of human motives. Her visit to Clara Henshaw the previous day had raised questions, and Leonard Henshaw, Clara's charming but elusive nephew, was at their center. Miss Marple's destination was the Rose and Crown, the village tea shop where gossip flowed as freely as the tea. Its bay windows glowed with warmth, and the scent of fresh scones greeted her as she entered. Mrs. Baker, the proprietress, bustled over with a smile. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. Your usual table?" Miss Marple nodded, settling into a corner seat with a clear view of the room. She ordered a pot of Earl Grey and a scone, her eyes scanning the patrons. Leonard was there, as she had hoped, leaning toward a young woman at the counter, his laughter bright but calculated. Mrs. Baker, ever eager to share news, lingered as she poured the tea. "That's young Mr. Henshaw," she said, nodding toward Leonard. "Been charming half the village since he arrived. But he's got a restless look, don't you think?" Always glancing over his shoulder, Miss Marple murmured agreement, her gaze fixed on Leonard. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, but his tie was slightly askew, a small detail that spoke of haste or unease. He caught her eye and flashed a smile, excusing himself from his companion to approach her table. "Miss Marple, twice in 2 days?" he said, his tone light. "I'll start thinking you're keeping tabs on me." His jest carried a hint of wariness, and Miss Marple's answering smile was serene. "Merely enjoying the village's hospitality, Mr. Henshaw," she replied. "Chipping Norton must feel quite different from London." Leonard's laugh was quick, a touch too loud. "It's a backwater, but Aunt Clara needs me. That house of hers full of creaks and shadows. That clock doesn't help." He shook his head, as if the clock's antics were a mild nuisance. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving his face. "It is peculiar, striking 13 like that. Have you examined it closely?" Leonard shrugged, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Not my sort of thing. Probably just old machinery playing up. Aunt Clara's got enough worries without that racket." His casual dismissal was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the fleeting tightness in his jaw when she mentioned the scratches on the clock's base. "Wear and tear, I suppose," he added, his gaze sliding toward the window. Their conversation turned to London, where Leonard spoke vaguely of investments and opportunities. Miss Marple listened, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind catalogued every pause, every shift in his tone. He was like young Mr. Carter from her old village. She thought a man whose charm outran his honesty, always one step ahead of questions. When Leonard excused himself, citing an errand, Miss Marple watched him leave, noting the quickness of his stride, as if he were eager to escape scrutiny. Her next stop was the vicarage, a short walk past the church, where ivy clung to the steeple and rooks cawed in the yews. Mrs. Ellison, the vicar's wife, was a font of village lore, her sharp tongue softened by a genuine kindness. She welcomed Miss Marple into the parlor, where a fire crackled and a tray of biscuits awaited. "You're here about Clara's clock, I'll wager," Mrs. Ellison said, her eyes gleaming. "The whole village is buzzing. 13 strikes." Old Tompkins says it's a curse, but then he sees omens in every cloud. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I'm more inclined to think of human causes, Mrs. Ellison. Have you heard anything about Leonard Henshaw's activities? Mrs. Ellison leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He's been seen at odd hours, you know. 2 nights ago, near the old mill, talking to a man in a dark coat. Looked furtive. My husband said he passed them on his way, back from a sickbed visit. And Leonard's been asking about Captain Henshaw's old papers, naval things. Strange for a young man with no interest in history. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her teacup. The mill, abandoned and overgrown, was a place for secrets, not casual meetings. She recalled a case from years ago, when a clandestine rendezvous in a barn had unraveled a theft. And this stranger, she asked, has anyone seen him before? Mrs. Ellison shook her head. Not a local, that's certain. Tall, with a limp, or so the vicar thought. Leonard called him a business friend, but who does business at midnight by a mill? As Miss Marple left the vicarage, the church clock struck 3, its chimes clear and orderly, a stark contrast to the chaos at Hazelwood House. She walked toward the mill, a crumbling relic by the river, its wheel long stilled. The path was muddy, and she picked her way carefully, her eyes scanning the ground. Near a cluster of willows, she found fresh footprints, 2 sets, one large, one smaller, leading into the underbrush. A scrap of paper, half buried in the mud, caught her attention. She retrieved it with her handkerchief, revealing a torn receipt from a London tobacconist dated a week ago. It was a small clue, but Miss Marple knew that small things often unlocked large mysteries. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting untouched as she pondered. Leonard's nocturnal meetings suggested a purpose beyond filial duty. The stranger in the dark coat, the receipt, the questions about naval papers, all pointed to something hidden, perhaps tied to the clock itself. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of city swindlers, men who used charm to mask greed. Leonard, she suspected, was not merely restless. He was searching, and the clock's 13 strikes were part of his game. As dusk fell, Miss Marple lit a lamp and jotted notes in her notebook. Leonard London connections, mill meetings. Stranger limp, dark coat. Clock scratches, possible hidden mechanism. She closed the book, her mind clear. The clock was a key, but to what? A secret from Captain Henshaw's past, perhaps, or a prize Leonard sought. Tomorrow, she would speak to Mr. Gray, the historian, whose obsession with the clock might reveal more than he intended. For now, she listened to the tick of her own mantel clock, its rhythm a reminder that time and truth always came to light in Chipping Norton. Chapter 4. The Historian's Tale. The morning in Chipping Norton dawned with a chill that seeped through the cracks of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, prompting her to draw her shawl closer as she sipped her tea. The village lay quiet under a sky heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but held back, as if reluctant to break the tension in the air. Her thoughts were fixed on Hazelwood House and its enigmatic clock, its 13 strikes at dawn, a puzzle that grew more intricate with each new detail. Leonard Henshaw's furtive behavior and the mysterious stranger at the mill had sharpened her suspicions, but another figure now occupied her mind. Mr. Percival Gray, the local historian whose interest in the clock seemed to border on obsession. Miss Marple set out for the village library, a modest building tucked behind the post office, its shelves groaning under the weight of dusty volumes and parish records. The library was Mr. Gray's domain, where he spent his days cataloging the past with a zeal that some in Chipping Norton found endearing, others excessive. As she entered, the scent of old paper and polished wood greeted her, and she found Gray at a corner table, surrounded by books and sketches of antique furniture. He was a thin man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a nervous habit of adjusting them. His fingers, stained with ink, moved restlessly over a notebook filled with precise diagrams. "Good morning, Mr. Gray," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but carrying the quiet authority of one who knew the value of courtesy. He started slightly, looking up with a mix of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect. That is, what brings you here?" His smile was polite, but his eyes darted to the sketches as if guarding a secret. "I've been hearing about your work at Hazelwood House," she replied, settling into a chair opposite him. "Mrs. Henshaw tells me you've taken a particular interest in her grandfather clock." Gray's face lit up, his unease giving way to enthusiasm. "Oh, it's a remarkable piece," he said, pushing a sketch toward her. It depicted the clock in meticulous detail, every carving and curve rendered with care. Crafted in 1780 by a Devon clockmaker, one of only 3 known to exist. Its mechanism is a marvel double-weighted, with a hidden compartment for valuables. Captain Henshaw used it to store naval documents, or so the family lore goes. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "A hidden compartment? How intriguing. Have you located it?" Gray's enthusiasm faltered, and he adjusted his spectacles again. "Not yet, I'm afraid. The mechanism is fiendishly clever, requires a specific key, long lost, I suspect. I've tried tapping and probing, but—" He trailed off, his fingers tracing the sketch. Miss Marple noted the faint flush on his cheeks, the intensity in his voice. "You've spent much time on it," she observed. "It must be quite a challenge." Gray nodded, almost too eagerly. "It's a historian's dream, Miss Marple. A piece like that holds history in its grained secrets, perhaps from Captain Henshaw's naval days." His words were scholarly, but Miss Marple detected a hunger beneath them, as if the clock were more than an academic pursuit. She thought of a neighbor from her youth, a collector who hoarded rare books, not for love of reading, but for the thrill of possession. Gray, she suspected, was driven by a similar impulse. She steered the conversation to Hazelwood House, asking about his visits. Gray described his cataloging work, mentioning the library's naval charts and Clara's reluctance to part with old papers. "She's sentimental," he said, "but those documents could shed light on the captain's career." "Pity they're so disorganized." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the contrast between Gray's meticulous nature and his casual dismissal of Clara's attachment. "And Leonard Henshaw," she said lightly. "Does he share your interest in the past?" Gray's expression tightened. "Leonard? He's more interested in the present London, money, that sort of thing. He's been poking about the house, though. Asked me about the clock once, but I doubt he understands its value." His tone held a trace of disdain, and Miss Marple filed it away. Rivalry, even subtle, could reveal much. As she left the library, the first drops of rain speckled the pavement, and she opened her umbrella, her thoughts turning. Gray's obsession with the clock was genuine, but was it purely scholarly? The hidden compartment intrigued her a place to conceal documents, perhaps ones Captain Henshaw had guarded fiercely. She recalled a story her nephew Raymond once told of a diplomat who hid sensitive letters in a desk's secret drawer, only to have them stolen by a trusted aide. Trust, she knew, was often the weakest link. That evening, after a simple supper of soup and toast, Miss Marple took her usual walk through Chipping Norton, her route circling past Hazelwood House. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and heavy. The house stood dark, save for a single light in the library window, flickering like a beacon. She paused behind a yew hedge, her small figure blending into the shadows. Through the glass she saw Gray, bent over the grandfather clock, a small tool in his hand. His movements were cautious, almost furtive, as he tapped the base, pausing to listen. Then another figure appeared in the doorway, Leonard, his silhouette unmistakable, watching Gray with a stillness that felt predatory. Miss Marple retreated silently, her heart quickening. The scene confirmed her suspicions. The clock was a focal point for both men, though their motives remained unclear. Gray's scholarly zeal might mask greed, while Leonard's charm hid a calculating mind. The scratches on the clock, the footsteps Clara's maid had heard, the stranger at the mill all pointed to a secret within Hazelwood House, one the clock guarded with its eerie chimes. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit her lamp and opened her notebook, adding to her careful list, Gray obsessed with clock's compartment, possibly seeking documents. Leonard watching Gray, motives unclear. Hidden key? She thought of the receipt from the London tobacconist, tucked safely in her drawer. It might belong to Leonard or his mysterious companion, but its significance was still a shadow. The clock's 13 strikes, she felt, were a distraction, a staged performance to unsettle Clara or divert attention. But from what? As she settled into her armchair, the mantel clock ticked steadily, a counterpoint to the chaos at Hazelwood House. Miss Marple's mind sifted through the day's observations, each detail a piece in a puzzle she was determined to solve. Gray's intensity, Leonard's secrecy, the clock's ominous chimes, they were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and she would follow them to their source. In Chipping Norton, as in all villages, the past cast long shadows, and Miss Marple knew how to read them. Chapter 5. The Midnight Visitor. The rain had returned to Chipping Norton by morning, a steady drizzle that turned the lanes to mud and draped the village in a gray hush. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a slice of toast untouched as she reviewed her notebook. The grandfather clock at Hazelwood House, with its 13 dawn strikes, was no longer just a curiosity. It was the heart of a mystery that wove together Leonard Henshaw's evasions, Mr. Gray's obsessive sketches, and a stranger glimpsed at the mill. Her evening glimpse of Gray, probing the clock, watched by Leonard's shadowed figure, had sharpened her sense of unease. Something was afoot, and the clock's chimes were its herald. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mary, the parlor-maid from Hazelwood House, her face pale beneath her sodden bonnet. "Oh, Miss Marple, Mrs. Henshaw sent me," she gasped, clutching a damp shawl. "There's been trouble at the house. Someone tried to break in last night." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her voice remained calm. "Come in, Mary, and tell me everything." She ushered the girl to the fire, pouring tea to steady her nerves. Mary's story tumbled out in a rush. At midnight, a noise had woken the household, a scraping at the library window, followed by the creak of wood. The butler, Mr. Jarvis, had investigated but found only a forced latch and fresh scratches on the grandfather clock's base, deeper than before. "Nothing was taken, ma'am, but Mrs. Henshaw's in a state. She says it's the clock they're after, and I'm half afraid she's right." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The scratches, so like those she had seen, suggested persistence, perhaps desperation. "Did you see anyone, Mary?" she asked. The maid shook her head. "Only shadows, ma'am. But I heard footsteps, heavy ones, running toward the garden." Miss Marple donned her coat and followed Mary to Hazelwood House, the rain pattering on her umbrella. Clara Henshaw met them in the hall, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling. "It's too much, Miss Marple," she whispered. "First the clock, now this. I feel as if the house is cursed." Miss Marple patted her arm, her gaze moving to the clock. Its pendulum swung with relentless calm, but the new scratches jagged and deep told a story of intrusion. She knelt, examining the base, and found a tiny scrap of dark fabric caught on a splinter, its weave coarse, like that of a heavy coat. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her thoughts turning to the stranger at the mill. The library window, forced open, bore signs of clumsy entry. Mud on the sill, a faint bootprint on the rug. Miss Marple studied the room, noting the desk's disarray paper shifted, a drawer slightly ajar. "Has anything been disturbed here, Mrs. Henshaw?" she asked. Clara shook her head, uncertain. "I don't think so, but Leonard was working here yesterday. He's been sorting old letters." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Leonard again, always near the heart of things. She questioned the servants, who added little but confirmed the footsteps Mary had heard, fleeing toward the garden gate. Old Tompkins, the gardener, was summoned from his shed, his face weathered as the oak he tended. "Saw a man last night, miss," he said, his voice gruff. "Near the mill again, carrying a lantern. Tall, with a limp, same as the vicar saw with young Mr. Leonard." Miss Marple's mind clicked like a lock turning. The stranger, the coat, the lantern a pattern was forming, and the clock was its center. Leaving Clara with instructions to secure the windows, Miss Marple walked to the post office, where the postmistress, Miss Carter, was a reliable source of village comings and goings. Over a counter cluttered with stamps and parcels, Miss Carter revealed that Leonard had sent a telegram 2 days prior, addressed to a Mr. Victor Slade in London. He called him a business associate, she said, her tone skeptical. But he was all nerves, dropping coins and looking about like he expected to be followed. Miss Marple thanked her, adding another thread to her tapestry. Victor Slade, a name that carried the weight of secrecy. The rain had eased by afternoon, and Miss Marple returned to Hazelwood House, her eyes scanning the garden for clues. Near the gate, she found a patch of disturbed earth, as if someone had stumbled in haste. A glint caught her attention, a small metal button, half buried, its surface etched with a naval anchor. She pocketed it, her thoughts drifting to Captain Henshaw's past. A naval man, a clock with a hidden compartment, a break-in with no theft each piece, pointed to something concealed, something worth risking a midnight trespass. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread her finds on the table, a fabric scrap, a tobacconist's receipt, the naval button. Each was a fragment, but together they whispered of intent. She recalled a case from her youth, when a burglar had targeted a manor safe, only to be foiled by a maid's vigilance. Here, the target was the clock, but why? The hidden compartment, Gray had said, required a key. Was that what the intruder sought? Or was the prize already taken? Leonard's interest in his uncle's papers, his meetings with the limping stranger, suggested he knew more than he admitted. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village settling into darkness. The mantel clock ticked softly, a reminder of time's steady march. She thought of Clara's fear, Mary's footsteps in the night, Tompkins's lantern-lit figure. The clock's 13 strikes were a ruse, she suspected, meant to distract or frighten. But from what? A secret from Captain Henshaw's naval days, perhaps documents that could still stir trouble years after his death. Leonard's charm, Gray's obsession, and now this Victor Slade, they were players in a game the clock had set in motion. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her mind clear. Tomorrow, she would dig deeper into the captain's past, perhaps in the village archives, where naval records might shed light. For now, she watched the stars emerge, their light faint but steady. In Chipping Norton, secrets hid in plain sight, and Miss Marple knew that patience and a keen eye for the ordinary would unravel them. The clock at Hazelwood House was more than a timekeeper. It was a sentinel, and she would heed its call. Chapter 6. The Captain's Secret. The drizzle had given way to a brittle autumn clarity in Chipping Norton, the kind of morning where every leaf gleamed with a crisp edge, and the air carried a faint tang of frost. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a modest breakfast of tea and toast, set out for the village archives, her steps as purposeful as the tick of her mantel clock. The mystery at Hazelwood House had deepened with the midnight intrusion, the naval button, and the name Victor Slade, each a fragment pointing to a hidden truth. The grandfather clock's 13 strikes, she was certain, were no supernatural whim, but a calculated act tied to a secret from Captain Henshaw's past. Today, she would seek answers in the dusty records of his naval career. For Miss Marple knew that the past, like an old wound, often bled into the present. The archives, housed in a converted stable behind the village hall, smelled of mildew and wax, their shelves sagging under ledgers and yellowed files. Mr. Thompson, the archivist, a stooped man with a reverence for order, greeted her with a nod. Miss Marple, Always a pleasure. Looking for something specific? She smiled, her request for naval records from the 1890s couched in the vague terms of a curious spinster. Just a bit of local history, Mr. Thompson. The Henshaw family, perhaps. He shuffled off, returning with a box of documents tied with faded ribbon. Miss Marple settled at a table, her gloved hands sifting through brittle pages. The records painted a picture of Captain Charles Henshaw, a naval officer of some repute until a shadow fell across his career. A logbook from 1895 detailed an investigation into smuggling sensitive naval charts allegedly sold to a foreign agent. The captain had been questioned, his ship searched, but no evidence was found, and the case was dropped when he drowned in a storm off the Channel. Whispers of treason lingered, though, preserved in a clipping from a naval gazette. Captain Henshaw's death leaves questions unanswered, and rumors of hidden documents persist. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Hidden documents. The clock's secret compartment, as Mr. Gray had described, was the perfect hiding place for such papers that could ruin reputations or fetch a price, even now. She recalled a conversation with her friend, Lady Harmon, about a diplomat who concealed incriminating letters in a clock, only to have them discovered years later. Could the captain have done the same, entrusting his secrets to the clock at Hazelwood House? And was Leonard, or perhaps Victor Slade, seeking them now? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint cough. Mr. Thompson stood nearby, holding a thin file. "Found this, Miss Marple." A letter from Captain Henshaw's commander, dated a month before his death. The letter was curt, warning Henshaw to secure certain documents or face consequences. Miss Marple tucked the detail away, thanking Thompson as she left. The captain's secret was no mere rumor. It was a prize worth breaking into Hazelwood House for. Back in the village, Miss Marple paused at the green, where children played and shopkeepers swept their steps. She considered Leonard's late-night meetings at the mill, the naval button, the forced window. The clock's 13 strikes, she suspected, were a diversion, perhaps to frighten Clara into leaving the house unguarded. But why now, 10 years after the captain's death? She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of London's black market, where old secrets, naval codes, scandalous letters could fetch a fortune. Leonard, with his vague business ventures, fit the mold of a man chasing such a prize. Her next stop was the churchyard, where she often found clarity among the weathered stones. As she walked, she passed Mrs. Ellison, the vicar's wife, who was pruning roses. "Miss Marple, any news on Clara's clock?" She called, her eyes bright with curiosity. Miss Marple paused, choosing her words. "It's a curious case, Mrs. Ellison. Tell me, have you heard more of Leonard's friend, the man with the limp?" Mrs. Ellison leaned closer. "Only that he's been seen again near the station this morning. Tompkins swears he's no stranger to Chipping Norton, says he looks like a man who visited years ago, asking about the captain." This was new. Miss Marple's mind turned to Victor Slade, the name from Leonard's telegram. A man with a limp, possibly known to the village, seeking the captain's secrets. It fit too neatly to be chance. She thanked Mrs. Ellison and continued her walk, her thoughts circling the clock. Its compartment, if it held documents, could explain the break-in, the scratches, the stranger's presence. But who had set the clock to strike? Leonard, to unsettle Clara? Slade, to signal an accomplice? Or Gray, whose obsession might hide a darker motive? As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her notebook open. She added, "Captain Henshaw smuggling scandal, hidden documents. Slade limping stranger, possibly known here. Clock diversion or signal." The naval button, she mused, linked the intruder to the captain's past, but its presence suggested haste or carelessness. She recalled a case from her youth, when a dropped glove had led to a thief's capture. Small things, she knew, unraveled great schemes. The village was dark now, its lights winking through the mist. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the mill, where Leonard and Slade had met. A midnight visit might reveal more, though she was no spry young thing to go traipsing in the dark. Still, she donned her heaviest shawl and took her sturdy umbrella, its tip sharp enough for defense. The mill was silent, its wheel a skeletal shadow against the river. She moved cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. Near the willows, she heard a low murmur of voices, urgent and hushed. Hiding behind a crumbling wall, she saw two figures, Leonard, his face taut, and a taller man with a slight limp, his coat dark and heavy. "The clock's the key," the stranger said, his voice low. "Get the papers and we're set." Leonard's reply was sharp. "It's not that simple. Gray's sniffing around, and that old woman's asking questions." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, her breath shallow. The stranger handed Leonard a small object, a key, glinting in the moonlight. "Use it tonight," he said. "No more delays." As they parted, Miss Marple retreated, her mind ablaze. The key, the papers, the clock. Her suspicions were confirmed. Leonard and Slade sought the captain's documents, hidden in the clock's compartment. But Gray's role remained unclear, and the 13 strikes were still a riddle. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, the key's image fixed in her mind. Tomorrow, at dawn, she would be at Hazelwood House. The clock was about to strike, and Miss Marple would be there to hear its truth. Chapter 7. The Dawn Revelation. The pre-dawn air in Chipping Norton was sharp with frost, the village still cloaked in the hush of night as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Hazelwood House. The sky was a deep indigo, pricked with fading stars, and her breath formed small clouds as she walked, her umbrella tapping the ground like a metronome. The events of the previous night, Leonard's clandestine meeting at the mill, the glint of a key passed to him by the limping stranger, Victor Slade, had set her mind alight. The grandfather clock's 13 strikes were no mere quirk. They were a calculated signal, and today she intended to unravel their purpose. Her small figure moved with quiet determination, blending into the shadows of the lane. Hazelwood House stood silent, its windows dark save for a faint glow in the hall, where the clock held court. Miss Marple had timed her arrival to coincide with dawn, when the clock would strike its eerie 13. She slipped through the garden gate, left unlatched as she had suspected, and positioned herself near the library window, where ivy offered concealment. Her heart beat steadily, though she was no stranger to the risks of such ventures. She recalled a night long ago, hiding in a vicarage garden to catch a poacher. The thrill was the same, tempered by the calm clarity of her purpose. As the first light touched the horizon, the clock began to chime, its notes deep and resonant, each strike a challenge to the silence. 1, 2. Miss Marple counted, her eyes fixed on the hall through a gap in the curtains. At the 13th strike, a figure emerged from the shadows within Leonard Henshaw, his movements swift but cautious. He knelt before the clock, the key from Slade glinting in his hand. He probed the base, his fingers searching for the hidden compartment Mr. Gray had described. Miss Marple's breath caught. The moment was pivotal, the clock's secret about to be laid bare. The hall door creaked, and Clara Henshaw appeared, her nightgown pale in the dim light, her voice trembling. "Leonard, what are you doing?" He froze, the key slipping from his fingers to the floor. Miss Marple seized her chance, stepping into the hall through the unlocked library door, her presence startling them both. "Good morning, Mrs. Henshaw, Mr. Henshaw," she said, her tone as mild as if she were calling for tea. "I see we're all curious about the clock." Leonard's face flushed, his charm replaced by a hunted look. "Miss Marple, this isn't what it seems," he stammered, but she raised a hand, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "I think it's precisely what it seems, Mr. Henshaw. You've been tampering with the clock, haven't you? To find your uncle's secrets?" Her voice was gentle but unyielding, and Leonard's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of her gaze were too much. Clara gasped, clutching her shawl. "My husband's secrets? Leonard, is this true?" Before he could answer, another figure burst into the hall. Mr. Percival Gray, his spectacles askew, a notebook clutched in his hand. "I've found it," he cried, oblivious to the tension. "The compartment's plans, in an old journal from the library, but it's empty." He stopped, blinking at the scene. Leonard, pale and cornered. Clara, trembling. Miss Marple, serene but commanding. "Empty now, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but piercing. "But not last night, I suspect." She stooped to retrieve the key, its shape intricate, designed for a lock no ordinary eye would find. "This, Mr. Henshaw, is what you received at the mill, is it not? From Mr. Victor Slade?" Leonard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silence a confession of sorts. Miss Marple turned to Clara, her tone reassuring. "Mrs. Henshaw, your clock has been striking 13 to unsettle you, to make you fear the house, and perhaps leave it unguarded. It was a clever ruse, but not clever enough." She faced Leonard, her eyes like twin lanterns. "You sought the documents your uncle hid, didn't you? Papers from his naval days, papers that could still hold value or danger." Leonard's defiance crumbled. "It wasn't my idea," he muttered. "Slade he knew about the captain's smuggling, the papers. Said they'd fetch a fortune in London. I only wanted to help Aunt Clara, to settle her debts." His voice was pleading, but Miss Marple's expression remained impassive. She had heard such excuses before, from men like young Mr. Ellis, who justified theft with tales of noble intent. Gray, still clutching his notebook, looked bewildered. "The compartment was empty," he repeated. "I checked the plans. There's nothing there." Miss Marple nodded. "Because, Mr. Gray, the documents were likely removed long ago, perhaps by Captain Henshaw himself, to protect his family." She turned to Clara. "Your husband's death was no accident, was it? The scandal, the storm, they were his escape, but he left the clock to guard an empty secret." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "He was troubled those last months. He spoke of mistakes, of things he wished to undo. But he never told me what." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind piecing together the final threads. The 13 strikes, the break-in, the key-all were part of Leonard's desperate bid, spurred by Slade, to uncover a treasure that no longer existed. Gray's obsession had been innocent, a scholar's pursuit, but it had drawn Leonard's suspicion, making him a shadow in the historian's work. Miss Marple handed the key to Clara. "Keep this safe, Mrs. Henshaw, and perhaps have the clock repaired to tick as it should." She glanced at Leonard, whose face was a mask of defeat. "The constable will need to hear your story, Mr. Henshaw, and Mr. Slade, I suspect, will be waiting at the station." She had sent a note to the village constable before dawn, her instincts honed by years of unraveling such tangles. As she left Hazelwood House, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft light over the village. The clock's chimes faded behind her, their mystery resolved. Leonard's greed, Slade's scheming, the captain's buried shame, they were human failings as old as time, and Miss Marple had seen them all before. She walked toward her cottage, her umbrella swinging lightly, her mind already turning to the next small detail that might stir Chipping Norton's quiet surface. Chapter 8. The Final Strike. The morning sun climbed higher over Chipping Norton, its light piercing the mist that clung to the village's stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple walked slowly back from Hazelwood House, her umbrella tucked under her arm, the events of dawn still vivid in her mind. The grandfather clock's 13 strikes had been silenced, not by a ghostly hand, but by human greed, and Leonard Henshaw's confession had unraveled the threads of the mystery. Yet as she passed the churchyard, where dew sparkled on the gravestones, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, tempered by the familiar pang of human folly laid bare. At Hazelwood House, the constable, Mr. Hargreaves, had arrived promptly after Miss Marple's note, his broad face creased with the weary pragmatism of a man accustomed to village intrigues. Leonard, cornered by Miss Marple's calm but relentless questioning, had crumbled like a poorly baked scone. It was Slade's plan, he admitted, his voice low, his eyes avoiding Clara's tearful gaze. He knew about the captain's smuggling herded from an old sailor in London. Said the papers in the clock's compartment could be sold to collectors, maybe even foreign agents. I thought it would fix everything. Aunt Clara's debts, my own troubles. Miss Marple had listened, her expression serene but her mind sharp, noting how Leonard's words echoed those of a young man she once knew, who had justified forgery with dreams of saving his family. "And the 13 strikes?" she prompted, her voice gentle as a breeze. Leonard flushed. Slade's idea. He rigged the clock with a timed mechanism, some gadget he got in London. Said it would scare Aunt Clara into leaving the house empty, make it easier to search. I didn't want to hurt her, I swear. Clara, clutching the key Miss Marple had handed her, looked betrayed, but not surprised. "You used my fear, Leonard," she said softly. "Your uncle's memory." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple touched her arm, a gesture of quiet strength. "Mrs. Henshaw, your nephew acted foolishly, but he is young. The clock has no more secrets to keep." Mr. Gray, still clutching his notebook, had hovered on the edges of the scene, his scholarly zeal deflated by the revelation that the compartment was empty. "I only wanted to understand the clock's history," he said, almost to himself. "The craftsmanship, the stories." Miss Marple nodded, her smile kind but knowing. Gray's obsession had been innocent, but it had drawn Leonard's suspicion, casting him as a rival in a game he hadn't known he was playing. The constable took Leonard into custody, his manner firm but not unkind. "We'll need to find this Mr. Slade," Hargreaves said, pocketing the key as evidence. Miss Marple had provided the station's timetable, suggesting Slade might be caught boarding the morning train to London. "He'll have a limp, Mr. Hargreaves," she added, "and perhaps a dark coat with a missing button." The constable nodded, accustomed to her uncanny precision. As Miss Marple left Hazelwood House, Clara stood at the door, her face a mix of relief and sorrow. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said. "I don't know how you saw it all so clearly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "People are much like knitting. Mrs. Henshaw dropped stitch here, a tangle there, but the pattern always shows if you look closely." Clara managed a small smile, and Miss Marple turned toward home, the village waking around her. At the station, news reached her later that day. Victor Slade had been apprehended, the naval button and a small lock-picking tool found in his possession. He was no stranger to Chipping Norton. It turned out a former associate of Captain Henshaw, discharged from the Navy under suspicion of theft. His limp, Tompkins confirmed, matched the man he'd seen years ago, asking about the captain's effects. Slade had tracked the rumor of hidden documents to Hazelwood House, enlisting Leonard with promises of wealth. The papers, however, were gone, likely burned by the captain before his death, a final act to bury his shame. Miss Marple sat in her cottage that evening, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a gentle echo of the clock's now silent chimes. She thought of Captain Henshaw, a man caught in a web of his own making, his secrets locked in a clock that outlived him. Leonard's greed, Slade's cunning, Gray's curiosity, they were threads in a human tapestry, woven with the flaws she knew so well. She recalled a conversation with her friend, Sir Henry Clithering, about the simplicity of crime. It was always, at its core, about want money, power, or redemption. The village settled into its rhythm, the church bells ringing clear and true, free of the clock's ominous 13. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her notes complete. Leonard greed, misled by Slade. Slade naval past, seeking profit. Clock empty, a ghost of secrets past. The naval button, the fabric scrap, the tobacconist's receipt, they had been small beacons, guiding her to the truth. She thought of Clara, who would now have the clock repaired, its chimes restored to order. Hazelwood House would heal, its shadows lighter. As she rose to make tea, the mantel clock struck 6, its notes a quiet counterpoint to the day's revelations. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Clocks, she mused, kept time, but people kept secrets, and in Chipping Norton, those secrets could not hide from a mind as patient and piercing as hers. She looked out at the darkening village, where lights glowed in every window, and knew that tomorrow another detail, another dropped stitch, might call her to listen.